to be able to share my story with you today. I am Catherine von Boer-Luther, or Katie, as Dr. Luther usually called me. It's been more than 6 years since my dear Martin died, and these have not been easy years for me. I was worried when he went to Eisleben, as I usually was when he traveled out of town. There was so much political unrest. He had been working very hard and had not been feeling well. But as usual, he went where he felt he was needed, and he assured me he would take care of himself. I was comforted that our 3 sons were with him, but while he was in Eisleben, my greatest fears became reality. I received word that he was ill, and he died before I could even be brought to him. His body was returned to Wittenberg, where thousands attended his funeral at the Castle Church, and suddenly I was alone. My best and kindest friend, my loving, loyal husband, was gone. Oh, it's not the first time I had known sorrow and hardship. My mother died when I was just 5. When my father remarried a widow with several children, our family finances, which were already strained, became that much more difficult. My father decided to enroll me in the convent boarding school for my education, not necessarily to become a nun. I lived and went to school there. Several years later, I was transferred to a second convent in Nimschen. Now, my father's sister Magdalene was at that convent. My mother's relative was abbess of the convent, so I was not completely alone. It was there that I entered the nunnery, and I was consecrated as a nun at the age of 15. As I look back, I realized that my life in the convent was very lonely, monotonous. Yet I learned some valuable lessons there. I did receive a good education. I learned discipline and the value of hard work. And I gained many skills that I was able to use later in my life. On the outside, I tried to be an obedient nun, but on the inside, I yearned for freedom. Thankfully, we were not cut off from the outside world. We began to hear about growing unrest in German society and in the church. We heard about Martin Luther, the Doctor of Divinity at the new University of Wittenberg, about his biblical teachings and writings, how he preached to the common people from the Bible in German and wanted everyone to have direct access to the Holy Scriptures. We learned that he nailed 95 theses to the door of the Wittenberg Church, explaining, among other things, why indulgences were useless. You see, the Pope had sent a man, Tetzel, and others into Germany to sell indulgences, simply signed pieces of paper, supposedly granting people forgiveness of their sins if they paid enough money. Well, Dr. Luther was assured from his study of the Holy Scriptures that God's plan of salvation had nothing to do with buying and selling, but rather that it was a free gift offered to all through the merits of his Son, Jesus Christ. When we had the chance, some of us began to secretly discuss those happenings amongst ourselves and to wonder if there could be any way that we could get out of the convent. You see, we couldn't just leave. Some of the nuns wrote to parents and other family members asking for help. There was little response. Keep in mind that smuggling of nuns was a capital offense, punishable by both the church and the state, and strict punishments were often handed out. It's little wonder that families were reluctant to become involved. So, we decided to send a secret letter to Dr. Luther himself. We assumed that a merchant who brought nightly deliveries into our convent could get that letter to Dr. Luther. And imagine our excitement when we received a reply from Dr. Luther, again by way of the merchant, explaining that not only was he willing to plan for our escape, but that he pledged his support for us when we got out. Well, our escape was planned for Easter Eve. Now, this was a night when we were able to stay up a little later for prayer, meditation. Everything went according to plan. At the appointed hour, a merchant with a couple of his helpers arrived at our convent with his covered wagon. There were 12 of us. We were helped into the back of the covered wagon. And although we had to travel some miles through Roman Catholic country, we were not discovered. We simply hid amongst the barrels in the back of the wagon. As I think about it, it was a little scary. But for once in my life, I was making a decision on my own. I was 24 years old, and I had been in the convent for 19 of those years. We made it safely to Targau. This was Easter Sunday. What a day of new life. And a couple of days later, we traveled on to Wittenberg. Now, Wittenberg was a small town, unattractive. Many buildings were not painted. Garbage was in heaps. Streets were muddy. The animals roamed freely. It didn't matter to me. It looked so beautiful because I was free. But now, the big question, what was I going to do? There were basically 3 options for runaway nuns. 1, get married, return to your original family, or find a new family to live with. Women simply did not live alone. Dr. Luther had written to the families of each of the escaped nuns. Only 3 were able to be reunited with their families. I knew that my father could not take me back. Our family homeland by that time was under the bitter control of an enemy of the Reformation, simply too risky. I was 24, homeless, penniless. I was actually past the normal age for marriage. And quite frankly, there was little honorable work for a woman to do outside of marriage. I wasn't sure what I was going to do. Dr. Luther arranged for me to be taken into the family of Philip Reichenbach. Now, he was a Wittenberg town clerk, a strong supporter of Dr. Luther's, and he and his family were very kind to me in the time that I spent with them. Their home was right in the center of Wittenberg, a hub of activity, great experience for me. I just didn't know it at that time. And then I lived with the second Wittenberg family, the Kronachs. He was a gifted painter. And they too were very kind and loving to me during my stay with them. Now, this was about 2 years when I lived with these 2 Wittenberg families, and during that time I did have a couple of potential suitors. One was a young man, his name was Jerome, and we were really interested in one another, but Jerome's parents, they were very wealthy. They wanted their son to have nothing to do with a penniless, runaway nun. Dr. Luther introduced me to a nearby pastor. His name was Dr. Blotz, and he was much older. I wasn't interested in him. By now I was 26. I had no money. I had no earthly possessions. What I did have is the same promise that we all have, that God takes care of his children. Well, rumors began circulating, linking my name with Dr. Luther's as a potential match. Now, I often went to service where Dr. Luther preached, and I secretly admired him from that distance. Once in a while, I even let myself imagine what it might be like to be his wife. I had no idea he'd ever be interested in me. So imagine my surprise when I heard that he was considering me for his wife. And once he made up his mind, he acted quickly. He did not need to go through the formality of seeking my father's permission. You see, my convent vow had officially removed me from the von Bora family. We really did not have a courtship. He simply asked for my hand in marriage. I accepted. And our betrothal ceremony was held soon thereafter at the Black Cloister where Dr. Luther lived, only a handful in attendance. We did have a public wedding celebration a couple of weeks later, and many people attended that, including Dr. Luther's aged parents. But no one from my family was there, none of my friends. I was 26 years old. Dr. Luther was 42. I was now officially part of his world. And I couldn't help but wonder why he had married me. I wondered, did he feel sorry for me? Was I an obligation from God? Was he trying to please his father, who had been upset in the first place when Martin had decided to become a monk? Was he trying to anger the Pope? And then I was concerned because a few of his friends were very opposed to our marriage. They thought it would harm the spread of the Reformation. You can probably imagine what his enemies had to say about our marriage. What a scandal. A defrocked monk marrying a runaway nun. At any rate, following our wedding, I moved into the Black Cloister with Martin. Now, the Black Cloister was part of a former Augustinian monastery, so named because of the black robes that the Augustinian monks had worn. Dr. Luther had lived there as a monk, and he continued living there while teaching at the university and preaching in Wittenberg. Quite frankly, the place was a wreck. Buildings and grounds in shambles and disrepair. I slowly began to clean the place up and to try to put a little order into Dr. Luther's daily life. He had confessed to a friend that he had not changed the straw in his bed for over a year. I often had to remind him to eat because he would become so engrossed in his readings and writings. Our marriage was quite an adjustment for a 42-year-old former monk. He wrote to a friend, "There's a lot to get used to in the first year of marriage. One wakes up in the morning and there are a pair of pigtails on the pillow that had not been there before." Oh, I don't have pigtails anymore, but I did then. And actually, our marriage wasn't such an easy adjustment for me either. We had so little time together. It seemed as if our home was always filled with visitors, mealtime taken up with theological talk. I yearned for Martin's affection. I had known little parental love as a child. And then, of course, I was in the convent for all those years. Now I was married, but I had to share my husband with so many other people. And then there was the work. In order to free up Martin's time for his important works of ministry, I tried to take on as many of the other responsibilities as I could, and there were many. In fact, I often got up at 4 a.m. to start my day. Martin often called me his morning star at Wittenberg. There was our home, of course, and often boarders, the meals, the crops, the gardens, the animals. And I was in charge of our family finances. As I think back, most of the major difficulties in our marriage had to do with money. It seems as if our limited income never quite matched our expenses. Dr. Luther did not like to take money for his writings. even though printers and publishers received money for them. When needy students and refugee monks made their way to our home, trying to find a place to stay, he did not want to charge them. He considered them our guests. When other needy people made their way to our home asking for money and we had none to give them, he would give them some of our wedding gifts. His attitude about money was that God had put fingers at the ends of our hands to let the money slide through. And that whatever we gave away, especially to those in need, God would somehow reimburse with his blessing. He had absolute confidence in God's promise to provide. Now, I don't want you to think that I did not trust and believe in God. I did. I just tried to be a little more practical. In order to save and to try to manage with our limited income, I began to ask boarders to pay if they could. I took advantage of the former monastery's right to brew beer, and I learned to brew our own beer and make our own wine. I leased additional land for crops and gardens. I even bred, raised, and butchered some of our own animals, with help, of course. Some of those work skills I had learned in the convent, and they certainly were put to good use in my role as manager of our home. Just a year after our marriage, our first child, a son, Hans, was born. Martin considered little Hans a precious gift from God, and I could feel a real bond of love developing between Martin and me. And added to our family joys, Aunt Magdalene, my father's sister, who had also been in the convent and who later escaped, came to live with us. Despite those family joys, however, there were times when Dr. Luther suffered bouts of melancholy and depression, as well as a variety of other physical ailments, no doubt a result of his years of austerity in the monastery when he did not take particularly good care of himself. I'm reminded of one especially long period of depression when he actually thought he was going to die. Well, one day, I decided to dress in mourning clothes, black, head to toe, heavy veil over my face. Well, when he saw me, of course he thought something terrible had happened and asked why I was dressed that way. And I simply said, "The way you've been acting, I assumed God had died. And I'm joining you in your mourning." And that seemed to bring him out of his lethargy just a little bit. When the Black Plague struck Wittenberg, students and professors of the university were ordered to leave. Dr. Luther, however, refused to go. And although we were expecting our second child by that time, I too stayed behind to help with those who were ill. Our home was sometimes referred to as God's Inn, and it became a haven for the sick. The work was endless. I was so thankful that I had Aunt Magdalene there to help me. Our second child was a daughter. We named her Elizabeth. Sadly, she died when she was just 8 months old. It was a time of great grief for our family. Over the years, however, we were blessed with additional children. Another daughter, Magdalene, 2 sons, Martin and Paul, and finally our last child, a daughter, Margaret, whom we named for Dr. Luther's mother. I was overjoyed when Martin decided to purchase the remaining portion of my family's Von Bora estate at Zulsdorf. Now, I had lived at Zulsdorf as a child. That was before my mother died and I was placed in the convent, so I don't remember much of it. I was so young. Nevertheless, It was an important part of my childhood, and knowing how much I loved land, Dr. Luther thought that the little farm would make me happy. My brother Hans had inherited it and was no longer able to keep it going. Dr. Luther was indeed right. That little farm made me very, very happy, especially after the death of Aunt Magdalene. She was like a mother to me, the mother I had never known. And Zollsdorf was a place of comfort for our whole family when our beloved daughter Magdalene died at the age of 13. And it became a place where Martin himself could rest. He was under so much pressure. His health was getting worse. He was concerned about bickering among colleagues of the Reformation, causing harm to the spread of the gospel. International tensions were alarming. During that time, Martin set out on frequent out-of-town journeys, sometimes to churches, to try to help strengthen them. Other times he was called to mediate disputes, political disputes. I always worried when he traveled out of town, both about his health, of course, and also about possible physical harm to him from his enemies. It was one of those trips that took him to Eisleben, as I mentioned earlier. Eisleben is actually where Martin was born and baptized. He was called there to settle a political dispute among some of the counts of Mansfeld. It was a copper mining dispute. I really didn't want him to go. He felt he should. I insisted our sons go with him. And it was while he was in Eisleben that I received word that he was ill. I sent some of his favorite household remedies to him, remedies I had learned in the convent, but he took a turn for the worse. And he died there in Eisleben at the age of 63. We had been married for 21 of those years. I was frightened and worried when I received word that my beloved Martin was gone. I had no idea how I would provide for myself and our 4 living children. Additionally, we had taken on the responsibility of several orphan nieces and nephews. I knew that I would do exactly what Martin and I had done throughout our marriage, and that was to rely on God for his loving providence. Following Dr. Luther's funeral and burial at the Castle Church in Wittenberg, I continued to live at the Black Cloister, which had been deeded to us early in our marriage. I had little money. Our land provided little income. Sadly, I felt deserted by some of the citizens of Wittenberg. Martin had made a will, which declared me to be his heir. He had never had it legally signed. He had a basic distrust of lawyers, and I think his reasoning was everybody knew him. So his signature on this will, witnessed by several of his friends, should be good enough. Because it was so unusual for a widow to be declared the heir of her husband's estate, I was so thankful when it was finally declared legal. Another issue was that under Saxon law, a widow was not automatically granted guardianship of her own children. They were often taken from her and placed under the care of someone else. The concern was, of course, that without her husband's income, she would not be able to adequately provide for them. I was very concerned that our 4 children would be taken from me and placed under the care of someone else. That didn't happen. I worked hard to see that it didn't happen. We were appointed guardians, but the children did remain with me. Another issue was that some officials were trying to take control of my property. and to deny me the right to administer the property that Dr. Luther had willed to me. And again, I worked hard to see that I would contain control, and I did. I think my stubbornness and determination that had sometimes frustrated Martin during our marriage stood me in good stead following his death. Various benefactors had promised financial help in the event of Dr. Luther's death, but a long-anticipated war between the emperor and some of the Protestant princes broke out. Money and attention were obviously diverted to the war. And to make matters worse for me personally, my little Zulsdorf farm lay in direct path of the hostilities. Wittenberg itself became an armed camp. My family and I had to flee for our safety. When we were eventually able to return to Wittenberg, I was nearly penniless. We discovered that the Black Cloister had been ransacked, some portions still intact. My little Zulsdorf farm, though, lay in ruins. Crops, gardens destroyed, animals gone. To make a little money, I once again started taking in boarders at the parsonage, which I had stopped doing following Martin's death. I was grateful for a sizable gift of money from the King of Denmark, a strong supporter of Dr. Luther's. And I even sold an expensive silver chalice. It had been a wedding gift, and I hid it when Dr. Luther was giving away our wedding gifts to the needy. I have borrowed some money. I am hoping to restore my farm and rebuild the parsonage. However, added to our present difficulties, the Black Plague has returned to Wittenberg. I'm not sure what I am going to do. I had considered leaving Wittenberg permanently, selling the parsonage, and moving to Zulsdorf, which is really what Martin, I think, had wanted me to do. But for now, because of the plague, I am going to stay in Wittenberg to once again help those who are ill, even though I felt deserted by some of them in my time of need. I do not intend to desert them. I have some serious decisions to make for myself and my family, and I am going to rely on God's direction for help in making those decisions. Now, if you will, permit me to step out of character and to simply tell you the rest of Katie's story. In a first-person portrayal, it's very hard to show one's own death. So I'm simply going to tell you that Katie did indeed eventually leave Wittenberg with her two youngest children. En route, however, there was a carriage accident. Katie was thrown from the carriage, and she suffered serious injuries from which she did not recover. Because of the plague, the university had been moved from Wittenberg to Targau, and when Katie eventually died of her injuries in Targau, her body was not returned to Wittenberg for burial. She was buried in Targau, where she died at the age of 53. Dr. Luther, of course, was buried in Wittenberg, at the foot of the pulpit in the castle church. So Katie and her beloved Martin are not buried together. The story of Catherine von Bora-Luther is indeed a remarkable one. The story of a woman whose life was used by God in extraordinary ways to further his kingdom. Thank you so much for allowing me to share her story with you. Thank you.